Hello, my name is Tiffany Melvin. I am in my fourth year of a double major in vocal performance and music education. And today I have a presentation for you titled Why Trauma-Informed Teaching. Before we go any further, I would like to announce that we will be discussing topics that are of a traumatic nature. And if at any point in the presentation, please feel free to leave if these things are triggering for you in any way, shape, or form. I would like to share with you that trauma-informed teaching is not my original topic. My original topic was why trauma-informed teaching in a music high school classroom. It was specific to a type of class and an age. But I actually needed to take a step back, and we will discuss further why that was that I needed to change my topic a little bit, take a step back into a broader view. First, I would like to share with you why I'm interested in this topic, why trauma-informed teaching. So I went to ILMEA, this is a conference for music educators of Illinois, and they did a presentation that was on trauma-informed teaching. However, this presentation wasn't really sharing with me why trauma-informed is a thought process, why is it important, where did it come from. This presentation was more of certain kinds of activities that can be used in the class and things like that. So it really perked my interest as to finding out more about where this trauma-informed thinking came from. Additionally, I was thinking about my personal experiences in high school. I've been through myself some certain kinds of trauma that involved my home life and trauma that involved my friends as well. So, and these all had effect on how I learned in the class. So with this trauma-informed teaching, I was really interested into what were teachers able to do to help inform my state of trauma? What can teachers do? And as we move forward, we can discuss strategies and why this kind of thing exists and what does it do to a student's learning capabilities. But I needed to slow my roll. As I started to dive into this information, I was so curious as to the applications of it. I didn't really step back and understand why it was there. So with this research, I started in a place, but I needed to take a step back, slow my roll, look at the bigger picture, and really understand where it comes from before I can know how to apply things. So where did my research come from? I began with Google Scholar, searching under trauma-informed practice in the classroom. I got a large amount of results ranging from social work journals, teaching journals, psychology journals, child development journals, lots of great information. And then I decided to narrow it down even further with trauma-informed practice in the music classroom. I got even less results, which was great. I was narrowing in my scope. I decided to see what a different search engine had, so I went to the Roosevelt library search. Trauma-informed practice in the music classroom. I got even less results, so I began to read. But as I started reading, I started to notice that there was something weird with the word use of in the classroom versus just trauma-informed teaching. As I was reading the articles presented by the in the verbiage, I was finding research based on situations and trauma experiences that were in the classroom, such as Title IX experiences between students and teachers, or abusive situations within the classroom. These are important topics to talk about. However, I was focused on the information that resulted from trauma outside of the classroom leading to inside the classroom. So I started over. I went back to Google Scholar and started super umbrella term trauma-informed teaching. I got a massive amount of results, searching through theses and dissertations, but still finding works within the social work journals, psychology journals, and child development journals. Not a lot in the teaching journals, and this really proved a point of that this is a child developmental research topic still right now. The teaching applications are still being discovered and founded, not quite in the teaching journals yet. But with this search, I really started to find the results that I really, really wanted. The best place to start is what does it look like? What does child trauma look like? And how is it potentially caused? The first article I will mention is Trauma and its Impact on Children. This article did a fantastic job of defining trauma and a traumatic event. As quoted from the article, A traumatic event is one in which a child experiences a direct or perceived threat of harm that renders the child feeling overwhelmed and fearful for their safety and the safety of those around them. This quote, I think, is, or definition rather, I think is fantastic in how it describes the child's feelings about themselves or the feelings of others. But also, using that word experiences, I would like to define even further that this experience can be either that the child is a victim, or they witness the traumatic event, or even they simply just hear about the traumatic event, can all have an effect on the child. And then followed with some statistics from the article, 34 million children in the U.S. experience what could lead to traumatic stress and an impacted psychological well-being. About 26% of children would either experience or witness trauma before age 4. And some kinds of trauma that were listed here also is abuse, neglect, natural disasters such as Hurricane Katrina, shootings, war, terrorism, death of a loved one, and I would also like to add that bullying is a form of trauma as well and can really have an effect on that child. With these traumatic events, you can see many different kinds of responses that come from a child. But keep in mind that response depends on the child's perception of the threat and the level of their coping ability, which can be altered by risk factors. And I'll mention risk factors in our next slide and what those are. But as far as emotional distress responses that we can see include a sense of helplessness, loss of control, anger, fearfulness, vulnerability, shock, confusion, can also be connected to the feeling of dissociation. They may not feel human. They're losing their sense of identity within themselves due to the traumatic event. This can also include emotional or social withdrawal, a change in self-perception. A massive dip in the student's self-esteem could be present as well, leading to the next category of behavioral and social problems. Students could begin to mistrust others. They don't trust anybody anymore. They could also feel betrayed by adults who didn't protect them. This can include educators who maybe were not even present during the traumatic event. They still feel betrayed by any adult who didn't protect them, or any person. There can be a struggle to regulate themselves physically or emotionally, which leads to outbursts ranging from aggression to isolation. There can also be seen as regression of skills, such as potty training. You could have a child who was potty trained and then go through a traumatic experience and no longer know how to use the bathroom. Connected it to learning in the classroom, students could have issues with memory, concentration, verbal processing, comprehension, attention, and it's also seen that students who go through traumatic experiences have severely lower standardized test scores, and about 24% of IEPs are due to students who go through traumatic events. Some clarification, IEPs are individualized education plans. These are for students who may need additional accommodations or modifications within the educational setting. So we have seen and explored some of the responses that we can see from children who experience traumatic events. And I previously mentioned risk factors. This is a series of factors that can add to the intensity of the reaction. Things such as intentional violence. Was the event that occurred intentional? And did the child know that it was? The proximity to the location of the event. Does the child walk by their place of the traumatic event on their way to school every day? Is it even in their own house? And this can add to the length of exposure being another risk factor. The longer that the child is exposed to the environment, the atmosphere, the threat, the higher the reaction, the higher the intensity. Additionally, the degree of closeness that the child has to the victims of the event. Victims or abusers, were they guardians or parents or siblings, anybody that the child may consider really close to their heart. Early and multiple, it is seen that children who are younger that go through traumatic events has a more intense reaction to the traumatic event, but also if there are multiple events as well. These are risk factors that can intensify the react we can see from children. So far, we have seen the child responses and some of the reasons as to why children can have these responses due to these kinds of events, but what in their brain happens and causes some of these physical responses, and what causes the responses for them internally. In Article 2, titled Empowering Students in the Trauma-Informed Classroom Through Expressive Arts, has a section that really dives into the working of the brain and how it manages these threats or this stress. I really appreciated this article because it also went into the use of body mapping as a form of expressive art to help students represent where is their tension they're feeling, what do they use to release it, also using the arts as a form of emotional release. I really appreciate this article for going into that. However, we're going to be focusing in this part of the presentation more on the workings of the brain and what comes from that. So looking at the image on the screen, you see on the left side is a scan of a healthy brain. You see that in the two circles, those are the frontal temporal lobes, also the part of the brain that can be considered the learning part of the brain. On the right side is the results of chronic stress, and in those circles you see a lot of black. There is not a lot of activity in that space. This is when the brain is in a triggered state. This is not a state of learning. There's no activity there. The student cannot learn. So let's dive into how the survival brain, or the stressed brain, will override that learning part, and how does it happen? So how does it work? The brain is experience dependent, meaning it will sense, process, organize, and store information based on developmental experiences. And our childhood is nothing but developmental. And if disruptions occur in this developmental process, neurochemical signals will go through periods of abnormality that can cause irreversible damage to neurodevelopment. For example, a threat is present and the brain registers that as stress. The signals start to go off, and then the brain then releases a steroid called cortisol. Cortisol then causes a physical reaction, including high blood pressure, depression of the immune system, tension of large muscles. For example, the shoulders. If you start to feel stressed, you could feel tight in your shoulders. This is a clear example of cortisol, the use of cortisol being released. Now, if a child is exposed to large levels of cortisol over an extended period of time, there will eventually be damage to the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the memory formation part of the brain. This brings the student into a state of fight or flight. We've all heard this phrase before. When there is a threat present and there is a threat that is registered, the body goes into this natural state of survival, of fight or flight. Think of it as the brain having an alarm system that is constantly being tripped and triggered. If it's constantly working and constantly going off, this then becomes overactive. It's having a hard time register what really is a true threat. So it's now just going off at anything that is potential. The alarm system is ringing constantly. This can be seen also as an example within unpredictable classrooms as potential triggers for things such as fire drills or pop quizzes or an inconsistent instruction giving, or anything that can be a non-positive, non-consistent, non-stable classroom has plenty of triggers that students could be experiencing, causing the overreactive alarm system every day. Additionally, through these uses of cortisol and the feeling of fight or flight, the part of the brain called the amygdala is in hyperdrive. This is the regulator of emotions part of the brain, and it starts to overdevelop. You can see results of students seeming compulsive or unable to complete higher order of thinking due to this part of the brain being overdeveloped. Through regulating emotions, it's trying to figure out what are you feeling and how do you register that? How do you calm down? Is it anxiety? Is it fear? Is it confusion? Is it what sort of things can the body do to calm this down? At the same time, the hippocampus isn't being utilized and is now underdeveloped. The hippocampus cannot override the stress response that the brain is so frequently releasing as a means of survival. But the hippocampus is desperately important as it adds context to the trauma. So as the student's amygdala is trying to think about what's going on and the emotion that's there with the stress feeling steroid of cortisol being released, so you have this emotional and physical reaction, the hippocampus is not able to add context for what is happening. The student could feel like they are still in danger, even though they are not even in the presence of anyone related to the traumatic event or even the location of the traumatic event. They just had a possible trigger that flipped the fight or flight switch in them as a means of survival. So that was a lot of information, a lot of emotional responses, and a lot of scientific, physical, chemical responses. How can a child possibly learn through all of that activity and in that space with all at the same time being expected to retain information? The answer is that they can't. It's so hard for them to be able to then focus on the activity at hand that is being encouraged by school with so many other peers and so many other triggers. So within Article 3, titled Trauma-Informed Flexible Learning, Classrooms that Strengthen Regulatory Abilities, we start to explore what are some of the things that we can do as teachers to assist students in the organizing of these thoughts and the organizing of these emotions, and how do you get around them and how do you manage that. We start to now see the true effects of what trauma-informed teaching really is. We know how the brain works, we know what the emotional responses may be, and these all take an effect into how we present our materials within the classroom. And going forward, I have a few examples. But first, let us be clear with what trauma-informed teaching and practice really means after all the information that we just heard. But keep in mind, be clear, trauma-informed practice models of application are still within further research. The application, as I stated in the very beginning of this presentation, is still being discovered, still being understood and applied in certain kinds of classrooms with ages and grades and classroom types, topics, categories. We're still trying to find the things that absolutely work for students. But additionally, let's be clear that teachers are not therapists. But the classroom may help more than you know. The classroom could be the only constant, positive, stable environment that the student sees all day. And that can help way more than a simple word to a student can. Trauma-informed teaching emphasizes on healing and growth. It is important to help the student find the tools to center their emotions and their physical regulation, but also find that point of growth where they can apply the knowledge that they've learned about themselves and put it in other traumatic situations that they may experience down the road, or how to handle these sort of emotions and rush of physical, emotional feelings that they have to be able to manage as developing adults. This article focused on two main thoughts of repairing, including repairing regulatory abilities and repairing disrupted attachment. Regulatory abilities falls under, has categories of co-regulation, self-regulatory, working with difficult emotions, managing individual behavior, so we're talking emotional and physical regulation. Repairing disrupted attachment, we're talking about those students who no longer trust others or feel betrayed. So how do we fix relationships between student to teacher, and teacher to student? Let's break this down a little bit further. So within regulatory abilities, we can talk about two different kinds of solutions. Cortical mediation, talking about top to down, working with the emotions and identification within the amygdala. And then with that kind of knowledge, the students are then going to be able to direct their own physical regulation. Secondly, the body's ability to self-regulate. If you work with the rhythm of the body, and once you get that centered, then the emotional part will be able to find that regulatory ability itself. So two different ways of thinking of it, top to down or bottom to up. And then within disrupted attachment, we're talking about relations between student to teacher. The student feels a safe conduit to learn with the teacher. Also, student to student, the peer to peer, feeling safe and that they belong in this environment with other people that are there to learn with them as well, encourages great learning. And then there's teacher to student. Not only does the student need to feel a safe conduit to learn with the teacher, but the teacher should be showing a sense of empathy, warmth, and genuineness to open up that conduit to learn. So I promised some examples that could be used in the classroom, and here they are. This article broke some of them down into 4 different categories. The first one being rhythm, helping them physically regulate. This could be, we're talking about bottom to up within that regulatory ability bubble. These activities can be done within all 4 of these kind of categories, and believe me, these are not the end-all, be-all kind of activities that can be done. These are just a few examples and some thinking points that can be taken within the classroom. But these can be done when you start to notice your students are getting agitated, they're stressed, they're not really with you on the topic. This is where students or teachers can be really aware of where their classroom is at. So, strategies, some activities. We're talking about silent ball game, silently have students pass around a ball. If you drop it, you're out kind of game. A clapping call and response game. This, in the music education world, can be sometimes known as the poison game. A simple responded back with the same thing, or other kind of rhythms, and just a clapping call and response. You could have students do it, students be leaders, and that kind of fun handoff. You could also turn it into a little bit of a lesson. You could track your heartbeat, teaching students where to track their heartbeat and maybe graph it. You're explaining to them if your heart rate is up, you have a sense of stress. If it's lower, then you're not as stressed. You're maybe calmer, helping students become more physically aware of their own rhythm. Additionally, walking with a student. Say, for example, you might have to, a student starts to get really physically agitated and you have to go on a walk with them. Walk right next to them, not in front, not behind, right next to them, and let the student set the pace. Eventually, you can notice if they're walking really fast because they're agitated. They'll reach a point where they slow down. This not only reaches the teacher to student or the student to teacher connection because you are making yourself known next to the student, but also acknowledging that physical rhythm of how their walking is. And sometimes, if need be, the teachers can set the rhythm as well. We move on to number 2, self-regulatory tools can be examples of ready-to-learn rubrics, how are you feeling scales, put up right on the board as a student walks in. You could have something like a traffic light and they take their specific magnet and put it on where they are with how they're feeling or how ready they are to learn in the day. Not only are these some of these great assessment tools for teachers of gauging where your students are, but also helps the students to acknowledge, okay, this is where I'm at, and it's encouraged that the students can go up and change how they're feeling throughout the day. It's also giving the students a sense of acknowledgement with how they're feeling and also helping them see, oh, I wasn't feeling good 5 minutes ago. I'm better now, so I can move it. There's a better awareness of how they're feeling. Category 3 was mindfulness. There is also extensive research on just mindfulness in a classroom, including breathing, awareness of the body, and stretching to release some of that tension. The 4th category we talked about in this article was de-escalation. One of my favorite examples is the teacher example. If a teacher shows how they themselves de-escalate, maybe doing some stretches, have the class join you, get some water, talk about your favorite flavor of water, but you're showing your students that you're human as well, that these emotions are present, it's not them fighting this emotional battle on their own. Also, create a safety plan with your student. If you have a student that is in the moment of development where they can identify, I'm starting to get really agitated, they raise their hand, they look at you and they say, avocado, that means they have to go to the bathroom. Have a safety plan, a safety word, something that the students can know that they can communicate with you with safely to feel like they're in the right space. Another example was an escalation map, which I have an example of for you on the next page. Here is an example of an escalation map. You have a timeline for the students throughout the day, sad on the top, happy on the bottom, and the students are then asked to chart their day, but be specific as to where these high points and low points were. So as you can see here, the student wasn't too happy waking up, but then feeling a little better when they got to see their friends, and then it went back up when there's literacy class. Oh, and there was a math exam. That was a significant trigger for the student. Okay, then it came right back down for lunchtime and recess, and it went up for music class. Music class is literacy class, seems to be a little bit of a trigger for the student as well. Again, this is another form of assessment that can be great for the teacher to understand where the student's triggers are, and how can you limit the intensity of those triggers now that you have that knowledge. Find out where those tripping alarms are for the student, and try to modify those in such a fashion that the student can understand what's going on as well. Additionally, this is a great reflection tool for the students as well, so that they're not ending their day feeling like they have no idea why they feel like an emotional whirlwind. Here, this can definitely show them where they had a bad day at or where they had a good day at. They're starting to identify their own triggers as well. So to answer the question, what is trauma-informed teaching or trauma-informed care? It is giving a feeling of being safe, letting them feel grounded, and helping students find the tools and resources to use so that they can heal and grow at the same time. But this is just the beginning. Stay aware of your students, read the room, provide these tools, but don't forget to try new things with your students and communicate with them, because this is such an individualized topic that you can see a range of responses with these range of traumatic events, that the students need to know that there are people here for them that are in their corner, that are trying to create the best possible environment for them as they can. And it's not just about the learning, it's about developing. And we are helping the process of growing adults. And this is a great way to do it. Trauma-informed, having an informed understanding of where your students are and what are some of the things that you can do to help them get through that. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation today. A few things that I would do to move forward with this would be to start to narrow in certain age groups. This presentation was focused on children and adolescents from 0 to age 17. So the next steps, as I said, would be to focus that age range, that massive age gap, focus in on that, and then also focus on the application into certain topics of classes. A music class could handle things in a different way than an English class would. So those are the next steps that I would take with my research and my searching, but I encourage you to do your own as well. Trauma is present in our society, and it's important to understand how it affects us as people, and it's important to understand how it affects our children as well. Once again, thank you so much for listening. I am Tiffany Melvin, and on the next slide are my sources of these 3 articles used. I hope you have a fantastic day. Thank you for tuning in.